In this video, I'm going to cover the Unity interface basics and how to make your way around and navigate within a scene in Unity. So this is just my same 3D project I just made in the previous video. If you already lost that one, you can reopen it or just make a new blank 3D project. It's just an empty project here, except for this test folder we made, but I could delete that right now. It makes no difference. I'll just go ahead and delete that. Alright, so every new Unity project these days has a scenes folder and a sample scene. One thing, so this project window, it's at the bottom of your Unity interface. This is where it just lists all of the files in your Unity project. If things don't seem to be matching the way my view looks for you, you might go over here to the top right corner and click default. This drop down right here in the very top right corner of the editor window allows you to customize the editor layout, but default is what I'm going to work with, just so that we're all on the same page and looking at the same stuff. So this is what it ought to look like right out of the bat. And then if you double click the sample scene, you should have a scene in open in this scene window. So at the bottom we have the project window. The big fun looking one is called the scene window, and this is like a portal into our game world. This is how we can edit our game and add things to it. Scenes I've mentioned are kind of like levels in your game, so we'll end up having many scenes in a larger game. On the left hand side of the Unity interface is the hierarchy window, and this is where it lists the name of the scene that you're currently editing and then all of the game objects within that scene. So the only thing that can go in scenes are game objects, and we'll talk about that more. And so by default we have two game objects in this scene, the sample scene. There's a main camera and a directional light, and the main camera gives us a view into the world, and the directional light is sort of like the sun. You can see the picture of it here. It looks like the sun that is illuminating the world so we can see things in our game. So if you were to double click any of these game objects that are listed in your scene, it should move the scene view so that it centers around whatever you just double click. So if somehow, I'm just going to do some crazy stuff. If somehow I was out here in space, I didn't know where my things were, if I just double click on whatever game object I'm trying to find, it'll take me back to it. If I was trying to find the directional light, I can double click that. That works too. If I'm in the scene view and I'm trying to find it, I can press the F hotkey, and that will take me to whatever I have selected here. Alright, so once I select a game object with left click, it'll highlight in the hierarchy here, and you'll see on the right side of the editor window we have the inspector window, and the inspector tells us all about the thing that we have selected. So I have main camera selected, and we can see it has all of these properties that we can modify and tweak to make our game work however we want it to work. And if I click on the directional light, you can kind of see that it has a little bit different properties, because a light is just a little different than a camera. So now that we've kind of covered the big chunks of this interface, right? We've got the hierarchy window over on the left side, we've got the project window on the bottom, and the inspector on the right, and then smack dab in the middle is the scene window. I think we should add something to our scene, and we can kind of mess around with the various controls for navigating the scene and manipulating objects within it. So if we go up to the top menu here, where we see the game object menu, we can select 3D object and then cube. And as long as you made a 3D project, this should work the same. So you click game object, 3D object, cube, and you should notice a cube pops up in the middle of your scene. So if you want to move around this 3D space here, if you hold the right mouse button. First of all, I'm going to really recommend you are using a mouse. You can get by with using the trackpad, but all the info I mention in these videos will be using a mouse, and I think you'll find that once you get used to it, you'll be able to be a lot more efficient and effective using a mouse. So anyway, if I hold down the right mouse button, you'll see the cursor turns into this eyeball, and I can kind of, while I'm holding it down, if I move the mouse, I can look around the scene. So if you're just looking out into space, it can be a little hard to understand what's happening, but if I'm looking at this cube, it makes it a little easier to understand how I'm moving the camera. And the camera I'm moving is not actually this main camera. That is just there. I'm not moving that. I'm moving my editor camera, which is different than, the player will never see through the editor camera. This is just for me to build my game. The player is going to see whatever this main camera is looking at, which is just staring out into the void. So if you can't find your cube, remember, just double click it in the hierarchy list here and it'll take you right to it. And make sure by default when you click on an object like this, it should have this move tool selected. Up here you see we have some tools. Far and away the most common one is the move tool, and we use the move tool to move objects in the scene. And you'll see the move tool, when it's selected, if I have an object selected, it shows me these three little handles, and they're color coded, and they're color coded to match the three axes of a three-dimensional world. So we have the x-axis is the red axis here, the blue axis is the z-axis, and it turns yellow when I highlight it, but anyway, so this one is the z, and then this greenish yellowish one up here is the y, and that's up and down. So if you want to look around your cube, you hold right click and you can look around the cube. If you want to move the cube itself, you select it. You can either select it in the scene window by clicking it here, or I could click it in the hierarchy, and then I can drag on any of these little handles to move it in that specific axis. So if I want to move it only on the x-axis, I drag that little handle and it's going to move only on the x-axis. If I click on the blue one, I can move it forward and backwards in the z-axis, and then up and down is the y. And you'll notice with the move tool, so I'm using the mouse wheel to zoom in a little here. If you zoom in and you're like past it, you can hold down the middle mouse button, and then if you hold down the middle mouse button and move the mouse, you can pan. So middle mouse wheel zooms, holding the middle mouse button pans. So anyway, I'm going to zoom in and zoom out and pan around and turn my camera with the right click, and just practice, orienting the camera around this cube until you're pretty comfortable with that. And so the next thing to notice is there's these little spots in between the handles of two axes. So where the red and green axis are meeting, I have this little red square here, and I can mouse over that and it highlights, and if I click that, I can move on those two axes. And you can see both those axes are now lit up while I'm dragging around. If I click on this one, I can move on those two axes, and same with these two. So that's the move tool. Now if I want to rotate my cube, I can switch over here to the rotate tool. So in the top left, I'm clicking the rotate tool, and now you can see the little handles have turned into this spherical sort of user interface, and I can drag any of those lines to rotate my cube. And so you can kind of see how much you've rotated based on that filled in pie slice. And let's say that I rotate it like this and I actually didn't mean to do that. I can just hit Control Z and that will undo my last move. So if I rotated on this axis and I meant to keep it perfectly straight, I can just hit Control Z, or I could go to Edit and then select Undo somewhere in this list. Yeah, Undo Rotate. There we go. And so yeah, you can rotate on every axis independently, just like you can move on every axis independently. And so I've made like now that's 3 rotations. My undos will go back pretty far, so I'm just going to keep hitting undo until it's back how I wanted it. Now, the next tool in this list is the scale tool. And you'll notice when you pick that, you get something similar to the move tool, except instead of arrows at the end, it's these like block handles. And so if you click, you can scale on a particular axis. You can see it's just stretching or shrinking it. I can make it taller with the y-axis. Or if I click this one in the middle, so I'm going to hit Control Z till I'm back at my cube form. I'm going to click the left mouse and hold on this middle part, and I can scale it uniformly. So that way I can make the whole box get bigger on every axis at once. So that's the scale tool. Now, these other tools we're going to use less, at least for right now. This one is for UI objects and 2D games. And this is just like everything all at once. If you want to be able to do all of the things with one single interface, there you go. And this last one is for custom tools, but you'll see we don't have any custom tools available right now. And then I guess, this hand, I normally don't need to use the hand because it's just the same as the middle mouse button. So for me, far and away, so once I have the hand selected, I can just like click and drag around. But for me, I'm almost always by default just on the move tool. And there are hotkeys for these. So they're mapped to the QWERTY keys on your keyboard. So Q is the move tool, W is, oh, I lied, Q is the hand tool, W is the move tool, E is rotate, and R is scale. So it just maps in a row like that, corresponding with this row right here. So anyway, I normally leave it on the move tool, and that helps me do most of my scene editing. Now, let's go ahead and add a couple more cubes. So I could go to the game object menu here and 3D object and add another cube. Or once I have that cube, I could hold control and press D, and that you can see it duplicated the cube. So now I have 3 cubes. You can only see 2. That's because these 2 cubes are stacked exactly on top of each other. So if I move one of them a little, it will reveal that there are actually, in fact, 3 cubes. Now, I think a good goal here would be if you click on your camera, you can see this camera preview. This is what the camera is looking at. And if I were to run my game right now, this is what my game is. It is this vast horizon of nothingness. So this play button runs your game. I'm going to click it again to stop the game. Our goal in this video is going to be to either move the cubes in front of the camera so we can see the cubes, or move the camera so that we can see the cubes. So if I click the camera, you can kind of see its projection. So I'm just holding right click, and you can move the camera around while you're holding right click, move the scene camera, that is, by using WASD. So actually, before we get to our goal of moving the cubes into the camera's view, why don't you practice just moving the scene camera while you hold right click, use WAS and D keys. So if you're used to like first person shooter games, this will be really natural for you. If you've never tried that, this might take some getting used to. But the WASD keys, they map, if you look at your computer's arrow keys, they map to that. But I guess Unity has right-handed folks in mind when they made these hotkeys, because it's just a little easier to keep your mouse on the right hand and then use these WAS and D keys with your left hand. So that works pretty well. And if you are moving around like this, if you hold shift, you can go faster. Just like in a lot of first-person shooter games, if you hold shift, you can sprint. It'll actually work that way in our first-person narrative game too. So this will be similar controls to once we actually make our game. The player will move kind of like this, except they'll have gravity and we can kind of go up and fly around. All right, so now that we can move pretty well around the scene, let's return to our objective of getting the cubes in view of the camera. So like I said, once you select the camera, you can kind of see it, what it's looking at with these thin white outlines. And so once I click off the camera though, that outline goes away. So I could try to kind of guess and maybe I could get it right. Hey, look at that, I did. But that's going to be pretty hard. So what I would recommend instead is that we move the camera so that the cubes seem to be in its field of view. So I'm going to use the move tool to kind of move my camera, and you can see how it's updating in real time until I see the cubes. And then if I run the game, I will see the cubes. Not the coolest game yet, but we're making progress. Now, you might be like, well, this is really awkward and hard to like move this camera to specifically see this thing. I agree. There's a nifty way to make it easier. If you just move the editor camera however you want the scene camera to be. So let's say I want my game to look just like this. I can position my editor camera just like this. Make sure I have the main camera selected. Go to this game object menu and choose align with view. And what this will do is move my camera so that it's positioned exactly how the editor camera is. And now you can see that the game has the exact same view as my editor window. And as I start to move away, the camera is still where my scene camera used to be. If you click the game window here, this is what I would see if I started the game. It's tricky because my game is not running now. I'm just seeing what I would see if I hit the run button. And this can trick a lot of people because at this point you're trying to click on the cubes, you're trying to move around the scene, and it just does nothing. So if you notice you're trying to do stuff and it won't let you, double check you're on the scene window and not the game window. And you'll notice when you run the game, it automatically switches to the game window. And then when I stop the game, it should switch me back to the scene window. And again, like if stuff gets like really wacky and all screwed up, I don't know, like, whoa, what the heck? I can always go back here to the top right and choose default from this drop down, and that will fix me back up. So if something seems crazy, when in doubt, just try resetting the interface back to default. Or even if it's still crazy, you can hit File, Save to save your scene, and then close Unity and reopen it. And I know that sounds corny, but that does fix a lot of strange behavior. Okay. So just a couple last things I want to mention in this video. First of all, now, I think when I saved my scene, you'll notice it in the hierarchy over here, it has collapsed and I can't see my game objects anymore. So you can actually left click on that and expand the scene and you'll see all your stuff again. So in Unity, when you see these tiny little arrows, that is an indication that you can expand or collapse something. Same thing in the project window down here. If I can right click and create a folder again just to have more things to hide. But anyway, now you can see I can click these little drop downs and see that it's expanding and collapsing this folder. And same thing with packages. There's a bunch of stuff in there. The packages stuff is like things that are built into Unity and you probably don't want to mess with the folders in here. Assets is where we are going to add all of the custom art and code and all that stuff that makes up our game. So this is where we'll be mainly focusing our attention in terms of adding things and modifying stuff. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that once I select something, either by clicking it in the hierarchy or by clicking it in the 3D scene view, uh, in the inspector, I see all kinds of information about it. And if I, for instance, move the position of my cube by dragging the handle with the move tool, you'll notice that these values here are updating in real time. So I'm changing, remember blue is the Z axis. You can see up here, this, if you ever forget what color is what, red is X, blue is Z, green is Y. So they map to these here. Anyway, as I drag this blue Z handle, notice that the Z position is updating here. Likewise, I could type in a new number here. I could type in 1, and you can see that the cube moved in the scene view. So, stuff I do here updates this, and likewise, stuff I do here will update this view. And another neat thing you can do is if I hover the mouse over like a little bit left of where I can type stuff in specifically, if I hover the mouse over here, you see the cursor is giving me these arrows. If I click and drag, I can move things on that specific axis, or I can just basically change that value that's in this little text input box by dragging. You can drag all the way past the edge of the screen. You can see now my mouse came back on the other side. So that's just kind of a nifty way to keep going as far as you want. So you don't have to let up and then do it again. All right, so I think that's all of the very basics of the Unity interface. There will be way more to learn, but we will do it incrementally as we work through samples.